Welcome everyone. This video is for week 3 of the course, which runs from January 21st until Saturday, January 26th. And I know the 21st is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but for the purpose of online courses, we still count that day as part of the week. You're welcome to take Monday off. It just makes a little bit more work Tuesday through Saturday for you. I do want to touch base if we've got 2 weeks done now, and I know this course has a steep learning curve. Both as an instructor, I remember that when I first started teaching, but also just the comments from students on evaluations, on their feedback on the course, that it can feel overwhelming at the very beginning. And unfortunately, I wish I could do more to help with that. However, on the other side of the coin, we need to understand the theoretical foundations before we move on into the actual development. And then with the group project, it adds a little bit at the beginning of the class, which can seem a lot, but I know in the end it's worth it, because later on in the semester, if you try to imagine adding a group project on top of everything else you're doing, there'd be no way. And so it seems like a lot right now, but once that group project is done, I think it will lighten up a little bit for each person. Although, if you're having trouble and still struggling with understanding assignments or what I'm looking for, or just any questions that you have, please contact me. We can email back and forth, we can meet in a Zoom meeting, we can talk on the phone, text, whatever's the easiest way to communicate for you. I'm happy to do so. I will say, so week 2 had a few assignments due. I will be grading those this week, and I'll be fairly lenient on the first grading. But in the feedback, I'll be providing some advice or helpful information in case I want to see something different on future assignments. So please check your feedback. I will have everything graded by Saturday, the 26th. So for week 3, what's due? Minimize that. There we go. It's a busy week because we have 2 chapters, and we only do this, I think, 3 times this semester. We have 2 chapters in 1 week. So bear with me, hang in there. So we're reading chapters 3 and 4, which is the genetics portion of child development, and the prenatal conception area. So it's really interesting, especially if you've had children, or we have several in the class this semester who are expecting a child either this semester yet or later on in the spring. So it's very interesting, but there's just a lot of material to cover. So bear with me. What we have is we have reading checks for chapters 3 and 4. This observations and development assignment, we only have 5 of these throughout the semester, so this is our first one, and I'll show you what that is and how that works. Then you have the Dear Abby letters and the reflective journal, just like last week for week 2. And then groups 1 and 2, which is brain development and nutrition right here, is due Saturday, the 26th. Groups 3 through 8 are due the following Saturday, I believe is February 2nd. So with that group project, make sure you're checking in on the group discussion board. Make sure that you're participating in that. It may be something that you have to check every day or every other day right now to make sure that you're on top of it. If your group has not met with me, I think scheduled right now, I've met with the brain development group, one of the media, TV, and computers, and then I'm meeting with another one this weekend yet. So if you haven't met with me, please let me know. And I'm happy just to check in and answer any questions, show you how to work Zoom, and things like that. Okay, so let's go into iLearn. This is the student view, and just a reminder, you'll see section 6 up here, but it's the same for section 11. You'll go down to week 3, and it's going to have both chapters listed. You can also just scroll on the main page here in the main section, and it will go to chapter 4 as you keep scrolling down. There's no discussion board this week, except for that group project discussion board that you should be working on. So that's one element you don't have to worry about. The reflective journals listed right here. It's the same for both chapters. The reading check, and then under chapter 4, there's the link for the reflective journal again. A reading check, the Dear Abby letters. This collaborative quest presentation is if you're in groups 1 and 2, where you will submit it. You can also email me. Most of the time it's actually easier than having to go look at the submissions. So either way works, don't worry. And then the observations and development is this last, under chapter 4, this last link to open. Okay, so the reflective journal, for chapter 3, we have 4 questions. Some of them can be a little bit of an opinion, I wouldn't say opinion based, but a little bit of a political stance connected to them. So for example, the first question is, should parents be able to choose the gender of their child? This is discussed on pages 73 and 74. Now there are circumstances that, and I've never been in this position, and so it's hard for me to relate to it, but there are certain families where they know that if they have a girl, because of a certain inherited gene, that every girl they have will have a certain disorder. Where if they had boys, then that disorder wouldn't be passed down because of the gene, the link that to which gene it's on. And so do they have boys so they don't have to struggle with losing a child to a disorder, or do they let nature play its role, and if they have a girl, then they let nature take its course as far as the inherited disorder? And so it's a difficult idea. Some countries have banned choosing the gender unless it's medically allowed, medically, I wouldn't say necessary, but medically approved for a medical reason, versus just saying, I had a girl and now I want a boy, or I have a boy and I want a brother, for whatever it is. That a personal preference isn't enough to choose. So you'll read about that a little bit more. Also, the second question is, why are multiple births so common? And what this is referring to is fertility treatments, and how typically we see with IVF, most couples, I wouldn't say most, but some couples will choose to implant or transfer multiple embryos, because then it increases their odds of having at least one embryo implant and grow gestationally and develop into a fetus and then have a live birth. Why that may happen is because you pay a set price for the IVF treatment, and then I think it's an incremental increase to add embryos. Whereas if you only did one embryo in an IVF process and it failed, you would have to pay the same amount for a whole nother IVF process, or a similar amount, versus doing one IVF with 5 embryos or 3 embryos. And so we do see some fertility treatment centers having their own guidelines as far as how many we will transplant, or what's the word I'm thinking of? There's a term for it. Sorry, it left my mind. But how many embryos they'll allow. And other places may not have those regulations yet. And so we see higher multiple births linked to the increase of fertility treatments. This last question, it talks about genetic testing, and there's a case study on page 90 that I recommend you read for this. There's also a video about it. But what would you need to look at for genetic testing? And so you'll learn more about that. Chapter 4, there's 5 questions. The only one I'm going to ask, some of them are easy. For example, number 1, you watch this video about prenatal development, what's the coolest thing to you? Okay, that should be a couple, 2 sentences, works there just fine. But this question number 4, it asks about low birth weight babies in India. The video does not specifically speak about India. It speaks just about in general. I think it's actually from Canada, the video, but it speaks about just low birth weight babies in general. So just answer that question as if India wasn't even stated there. Then the Dear Abby letters, when you look on that page, they're split into chapter 3 and chapter 4. You'll notice right here it will say chapter 3, answer both letters, but then because there's only 2 listed. But then in chapter 4, you need to do 2 out of the 3. So pick whatever 2 you want and respond to them. And remember the requirement, it's listed right here, but write a full paragraph with at least 5 sentences with details. Oops, sorry. Okay. I do want to just add a little bit here. For question number 2, it's talking about a woman who learns that she's pregnant and what can she do, especially during that first trimester, to promote a healthy pregnancy, promote a healthy baby. And we're going to learn in the text this week and in the material that diet, nutrition, taking your prenatal vitamins, or making sure that your diet fulfills the requirements of a prenatal vitamin. So you need so much folic acid, whether you get that from taking a prenatal vitamin or maybe you change your diet and eat enough green leafy vegetables, which are high in folic acid, to count for that. That's fine. But we're going to be, you don't allow toxins in your body. You don't do certain things. And those are wonderful things to do. And I preface this question because you can do everything exactly right, and your daughter or son, your child, may have defects. I share this, our youngest daughter, her name is Gemma, and she's 10 months old. My pregnancy was fine with her. I did everything. I may have missed a few days of my prenatal vitamins, but I was very diligent about maintaining a healthy body and, of course, following the word of wisdom. And she was born, and shortly after her birth, we went to a pediatrician for a check, and they detected a heart murmur. And no one in our families has a history of heart murmurs. My older 2 children did not have one. And so they referred us to a cardiologist. But we went assuming that it was going to be something called an ASD or a VSD, which is a small hole between 2 chambers of the heart. And it sounds not great, but actually there's a high prevalence of it, and it typically closes up on its own by the time a child is about preschool age, so about 4. And so we went assuming that's what it was and that it was going to be just fine. Maybe we come back every year to make sure it's closing more, but it wasn't going to inhibit her life. So we went to the cardiologist, and it's not that. She actually has a valve that doesn't open all the way. And when we first went, it was in the mild range of it couldn't open all the way, but open most of the way. There's a percentile that was linked to it. But it can worsen up to about a year of age. So we go back to the cardiologist every 8 weeks since she was born. And each appointment, it has gotten worse. And so she will have surgery shortly after turning 1 to repair her valve, with the hopes that that's all we need to do. Depending on how that surgery goes, will determine her quality of life as far as sports and high energy activities. She will be high risk if she chooses to have children of her own because of this specific disorder or defect. But I share that with you because a parent can do everything according to the textbook perfectly. But when an embryo and fetus are developing, things can still go wrong. And I don't say go wrong, but just not form correctly anatomically. Or we look at trisomy 21, trisomy 18, Edwards syndrome and Down syndrome, where a parent has no control over how many chromosomes are there. You have very little control. It's a complete random event as far as genetics go. Now, is it completely random event in our Heavenly Father's plan for our family? That's up to the individual. So this question is good to ask, that there are things that we should encourage young mothers, expectant mothers to do, but also understand that things can still happen, and that we're grateful for the medical care and the advancements in medical technology that allow us to live a higher standard or a higher quality of life despite or with the defects that we may be born with. This last question talks about labor and delivery for first-time mothers, as well as C-sections, vaginal births, the different options like that. I do want to state this very interesting article. Let me pull it up here. It's from 2017, but it actually, it's made the headlines recently and this is a little bit of a case study, but it does show, someone here, sorry, that the U.S. has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in a developed nation. So take out what that means is in the developed nation. So countries like the U.S., so Canada, China, most of European countries, some of the African countries would not be counted in that developed nation category. But you look at the prominent nations that have healthcare, that have hospitals, that we have one of the highest mother mortality rates compared to our the other developed nations. And one argument for this is that there's so much focus on the infants that the mothers aren't the primary patient. And so this case study or this article shares a story of a mother who complained about certain pains during childbirth, and the nurses and doctors just said, okay, we'll increase your epidural, or we'll give you this, or we'll do this, but never looked beyond that. And she actually had preeclampsia and then went into sepsis and passed away about 24 hours after giving birth to her child because a failure to look at the signs and to test the signs. And so with this, I do preface this by saying there is an increased link between inductions and C-sections. That link is very well known or established, that you're more likely to have a C-section if you're induced, especially if you're induced before 40 weeks. So some people will do 39 weeks because that's when it works out time-wise. But unfortunately, it can also increase the risk of a C-section, which is surgery. And so there's a whole slew of side effects and effects from surgery itself, let alone a C-section. But this is a good article. If you're pregnant, I probably wouldn't read it. But just be aware also if you're a mother or you care for people who are pregnant, just to check in with the mom through the delivery process, through the first couple weeks afterwards, to check on them. I know one difference I've read, that there's a difference in postnatal visits. So in some countries, especially Europe, the midwife, which is a lot more prevalent there, will come and do home visits at like 3 days postnatal, a week, 2 weeks, and 6 weeks. Whereas here in the US, it's very prominent to just go for a 6-week check. So you leave the hospital and then you wait 6 weeks to see your doctor. A study has shown that there is less rates of postpartum depression in nations that have more checks with a midwife or a doctor in the postnatal period versus the United States, where you wait the full 6 weeks. Of course, you can go in if you need it earlier, but waiting those 6 weeks can sometimes leave it undiagnosed or unacknowledged. So just take that into account when you answer this question. Like I said, there's some resources to answer that as well. Here is what the observations and development assignment looks like. This question, or this assignment, is going to look at the research methods in chapter, connected a little bit from chapter 2 and into chapter 3 with genetics a little bit. So you're gonna watch this Jane Elliott video. It's actually a very pivotal study in child development. So if you're with a group of people who study child development and you bring up Jane Elliott, most of us would know who that is and what study it is. It's a study from, I believe, the 60s, 70s, 50s, during the height of discrimination in the US. And so Jane Elliott is a teacher at a school with 2nd, 3rd graders, and she decides to test if discrimination is inherent, is a nature trait, or is it nurture? Do we learn discrimination? Do we learn those terms and attitudes and behaviors to discriminate? And so after you watch the video, you're going to what appears to be the hypothesis from Jane Elliott. Which research method does she use? And this is going to be from chapter 2, pages 22 through 28. And then this is the continued. What are the independent and dependent variables? This will be again from those same pages in the text. I just realized though that if you don't have page numbers in the ebook, you can't. It's going to be discussed with the research method, the cross-sectional, longitudinal studies, those terms. You can, yeah, okay. Independent and dependent variables are also right in that same section. And then the textbook doesn't include the ethical standards for research in children, the SRCDs, but you can use the IRB or the ethics section, which is on page 30. So just a few pages after, I'm sorry, with no page numbers, that changes a little bit, but right after, same thing in chapter 2. And then you're going to watch this Piaget experiment and just explain how Piaget would explain the thinking of the child. So again, from chapter 2. If you have questions on these, let me know. I'm going to work on getting page numbers somehow, because I know that's frustrating to you, as well as to me when that's what I have, and I can't send you more details on that. So I will look into that this week. Lastly, for the Come Follow Me application, this week in the Come Follow Me curriculum for individuals and families, it talks about our premortal existence. And as members of the church, we believe that life begins before conception, that we lived with our Heavenly Father and our Heavenly Mother in the premortal world, and then are sent here, or we come to earth to live. And as we study prenatal development, I think it's very important as a member of the church to understand that our prenatal development isn't the beginning, that we developed spiritually in the premortal world and then continue that development in the prenatal development and then after birth as we grow. And so understanding that there's a broader picture, that it begins before we can hear a heartbeat. Sometimes you'll see that life begins with a heartbeat at so many weeks, but really as a member of the church, we believe that life began well before that. And how grateful we are for that knowledge. There is a scripture in John that supports that. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. And the verse 3 is what I find. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And so I testify that all things are made by our Creator, with and without the physical and the spiritual and the mental and the emotional defects or delays or inabilities that we may be born with here on earth, that we were made by our Creator, and we were made with the knowledge that we would become perfect. That here on earth we may have physical ailments or spiritual ailments or mental or emotional, however they're affecting you. But I do testify that we are made by a perfect Creator and that we are made to become perfect. That one day those ailments, those inabilities will be perfected, and that we will stand before our Maker and become perfect through the power of the resurrection. If you have any questions on this chapter, please let me know, and I'll be happy to help. But otherwise, good luck. I look forward to seeing your assignments.